Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. Host JP John Poz. With me again on the show is a writer, a journalist, and author. Of course, the author of this little bad boy here. Say hello to the bad guys. The nWo book, Mr. Marc Raimondi. Mark, welcome back. How you doing?
What is up, John Poz? How are you?
I'm very good. What's going on in your world? You seem like a whirlwind is going on with this new book.
Yeah, we're kind of mid book tour right now. I'm in Huntington Beach, California. We have our book release event tonight here, and the book just came out this morning. And I go back to Atlanta for for more book stuff, more events coming up this weekend. It's been a lot. We were in New York last week, but man, just so fun. And the best part is really just meeting wrestling fans. Like I was just getting tacos yesterday in LA, and a gentleman and his son walked in, and this gentleman was wearing a Yeet T-shirt, a Jey Uso T-shirt, and I just thought it was so cool, just running into a wrestling fan in the wild, and I actually ended up giving them a signed book, and it was a really cool experience, and that's just my favorite part of all this. It's like, as much as I enjoy talking to folks like you, John, and you're the best. I have a great affection for you, but sharing with wrestling fans and kind of being part of that community is kind of the best part of all of this.
I love that though. Seeing the shirts in the wild or running into a fan just randomly in the wild. I love that stuff. It was in Lowe's. I saw a guy wearing it would look like a WrestleMania 39 shirt. I was looking, I was like, WrestleMania goes Hollywood. I was like, wow, that's so random. I guess this guy from New Jersey was wearing a WrestleMania 30. I was like, man, in the wild here, just randomly at Lowe's. This is great. I love when that happens.
Yeah, and I feel like it's starting to happen more because in the 90s, talking about the nWo and that era, seeing a wrestling shirt was pretty common. Like almost every time you went
Yes.
out, if you went to the mall, you were going to see an nWo shirt or an Austin 316 shirt or maybe a Degeneration X t-shirt. But I feel like it's coming back where I'm seeing more. I was in New York last week and I saw a younger guy, probably like in his 20s or maybe even teens, wearing an Eddie Guerrero shirt, and I thought that was so cool. And let's bring that back. Let's stop being ashamed of being wrestling fans, right? This is a
Right.
beautiful art that we're all fans of here. Let's put the stigma aside. WWE is on Netflix, like it is mainstream. Let's get out there. Let's show our colors.
I agree. Let's do that. Get out there. Like you said, we were in high school. Oh my God, everybody's wearing wrestling shirts and wrestling paraphernalia. I mean, it was out of this world. I love watching current wrestling though, and seeing that there's always NWO shirts in the crowd, no matter what, no matter
Isn't that
where they
crazy?
are. It's nuts, right?
29 years later, I mean, what has had that kind of impact? I mean, on the business, on culture, 29 years later, and this is still something that is at the forefront of people's minds. That iconic T-shirt, that iconic logo. It's incredible.
Very simple, but perfect. You know what I mean? It's just it's one of those things where I don't know if you could have like thought it up any better or created the idea any better. It was just literally the most perfect logo, and obviously 30 years later, people are still wearing it like crazy at the shows, and even at concerts that I go to, I always see NWO shirts. Maybe it says stuff about the concert I'm going to, but still, there's always NWO shirts there.
Yeah, and in the book, and I talked about this a little bit. I was able to finally, after almost 30 years, find the person who designed the logo, who knew no one knew who she was, and she was kind of lost to time. She worked for Disney MGM Studios down in Orlando back in the 90s, and they needed a logo, and they couldn't get to Atlanta because of the Summer Olympics, and they went over there, and this woman, Jenny Hines, she's Jenny Sloan now, her married name, and she designed the logo, and then everyone forgot. No one knew who she was, and I was able to kind of track her down. That's one of my favorite parts of the book. Like finally, this person is getting credit for one of the most iconic logos in like American pop culture.
It is crazy that Jenny, all these years, kind of never got any credit, never got any sort of obviously financial credit either for it, which is nuts when you think about it. It's like her work, and it got so famous, and everyone kind of forgot. Isn't that weird though? Like, how the hell does that happen? It's just nuts.
I don't know. It was a product of like WCW back then being so fly by the seat of your pants, right? Like they were really trying to figure it out as they went, and it was just a conversion, a convergence that created magic, because they really were not prepared for how big the NWO was going to be. They didn't know. to have shirts ready, right? I mean, today's WWE, John, you know this, like if someone comes back, someone debuts, something happens, they have a shirt immediately. Someone wins the title, the shirt is out. It's on a graphic on before the end of the broadcast is over. Back then, they didn't have that, and they just didn't know how big this was going to end up being, and they didn't have like they weren't wearing the shirts on the show, like on Nitro with the nWo logo until like 6 weeks after Bash at the Beach. It was like September by the time they got the shirts on, wearing on Nitro. Can you imagine that happening now? But it was a different day and age, and it's just it's kind of fun to look back and see like what they caught lightning in a bottle, and no one could have predicted it the way that it happened, but they really created like this incredible magical span of time that everyone is still talking about.
Crazy thing too, like Roman Reigns returned last year at SummerSlam. His shirt was available like 5 minutes after he came out. It was like, holy crap. And they're already going, I go into the WWE shop. And then you get an email, OTC shirt. Like, obviously nowadays, if the nWo happened, they probably would even have, blown up just as far as merch, even bigger. Although now, if you go to WWE, they think they sell $3 million at least a year of nWo stuff. So it's just crazy to think of like the merch aspect of it. Like you said, man,
it's insane. And I love a lot of that stuff is in the book too, about how they really kept true to kayfabe when they were marketing the nWo, when they were doing the merchandise, because they started out selling nWo merchandise out on the street outside the arena to make it feel like it was like counterfeit, like it was bootleg stuff. Like you see anytime you go to an event, like a concert or a wrestling event, there are people outside selling unlicensed shirts, whatever, and they were doing that, but it was actually the legitimately licensed WCW nWo shirts, but they did not tell anyone that. They were outside making it seem like it was this renegade group, selling their t-shirts. So I thought that was really a brilliant stroke of like, how do you have the marketing align with the storyline? I thought that was really, really well done.
Like renegade marketing, like they're just out there like outlaws. They're just out there selling their stuff. They're not a part of the show. Very cool, innovative.
Yeah, because if you just put the nWo shirts at the merchandise stand inside the arena, John, with the other WCW stuff, with like the Sting stuff and Lex Luger stuff, then you could. I mean, it would be phony, right? It would just make it like another storyline, and this was so much bigger than just another wrestling storyline.
I remember getting the nWo catalog. You remember the big white piece of paper? You open it up, it had all the stuff in there, the T-shirts, the little pendants. I got all of them. I got my nWo hat. I got my Hogan black in the, I guess it's like Terminator style shirt back there. I got the nWo hat, the Hall of Nash shirt, the Hall of Nash pants, like all this, but it was nWo catalog. No WCW stuff on it. I thought that was so cool and so different.
Correct. And they sent out, like you said, a separate nWo catalog, and it had a different number than the WCW, like merchandise number, a different, like, I mean, it was, they really made sure to keep it separate, even though when you called, it was going to be the same people picking it up, but the number was different because they didn't want anyone to say, oh, this is not real. The nWo is just going to the WCW phone line. And that was like the commitment that they made to that storyline was so they really went all in. They really went all in on making it feel as real as possible. And it was very effective. And it's harder to do now in 2025 because of social media and for, the technology that we have. But in 96, I mean, they really had people legitimately thinking that Hall and Nash were coming from the WWF and invading WCW, trying to take over. I mean, that is like, that's a powerful thing, like that idea, like that, that hey, we know, we all know that wrestling is scripted, it's a show, but this is different. This is like, wow, this is, Hall's coming out of the crowd, he's not supposed to be there, this is real. And that was like, people really thought that. And it's funny think of that now because of what we know, in the history, but back then it was different. And it was again, they created something really, really special.
And think about it, WWF was suing them because people thought that there was WWF into WCW, right? I mean, there was a big, huge lawsuit going involved in that.
There was, yeah. I mean, almost immediately after Scott Hall showed up, WCW got sued by the WWF, and it was kind of inevitable. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in the book is I was able to obtain about over 4,000 pages of documents from that legal proceeding, from the case. And most of them have not been unearthed yet. And some of the stuff that I found out was like, the narrative is kind of, that they were always going to use Scott Hall and Kevin Nash as their names because it was more realistic. It was their real names. But the truth is that they did trademark searches for other names for Hall and Nash, like the bad guy for Scott Hall, which was just a nickname from Razor Ramon, and for Kevin Nash, Axel, which was just kind of like another way of saying Diesel, right? It was like a derivative of Diesel. So they were actually trying to like give them names that called back to their tenure in the WWF. And Turner Legal came back to WCW and said, yeah, no, we can't use those names because we're going to get sued. And they ended up getting sued anyway. But that actually was true. Like if Turner Legal said, yeah, sure, Kevin Nash would have been Axel and Scott Hall would have been the bad guy. And honestly, John, I don't think the storyline would have been as big if that was the case. I think it needed the real names. I think it would have been just another kind of like hokey, wrestling storyline if they ended up being the bad guy and Axel.
Right. It doesn't quite hit as well. It doesn't quite work as well. No. It's kind of very gimmicky, very almost WWF-y at the time. You know what I mean? Very new generation. That's not very cutting edge.
Exactly. So it was actually kind of an accident that ended up playing in their favor quite a bit.
Crazy, too, when you think about it. Okay, they get Hall, they get Nash. Obviously, the worlds have to just converge where their contracts are up very, very close, obviously within 2 weeks of each other. That happens. The fact that people are not knowing because they were literally just on, especially Diesel was just on a pay-per-view. So it's like people not really realizing. I mean, if that doesn't happen, you're not going to get the NWO. I mean, it's just perfect synergy with the contracts.
It is really amazing how it all happened because, like, the chain of events, I guess like so many things in human history, like it's just that the chain of events is so rare. Like it's almost impossible to like it's stranger than fiction, right? Because the way that it all started was Sean Waltman is taking time off. He's injured from the WWF. It's like late 95, early 96. And he goes out to LA to do some rehab. He's going to do some training in martial arts, some stunts for movies. He wants to try to break into Hollywood. He's sleeping at the home of the Gold's Gym Venice owner, Rich Minzer, I believe is the name. It's in the book. And he's staying there and he asks Rich Minzer, like, hey, I really want to do something in acting. I want to see if I can get some movie roles or TV, because even at his young age, he was still in his early 20s at that time.
Yeah. He
felt like, his body was breaking down from wrestling and who knows how long he was going to be able to do that. So he really wanted a different career. So he's staying at the home of this guy from Gold's Gym, and there's a connection where the guy from Gold's Gym, Rich Minzer, knows a Hollywood agent whose name is Barry Bloom. And so Sean's like, can you just set me up with a meeting with Barry Bloom, this agent? And Barry Bloom was, really a pretty big Hollywood agent at that time who also had represented Jesse Ventura. And so he was very familiar with wrestling, and he was a fan of wrestling, but he also, had all the Hollywood connections. In fact, he was helping Eric Bischoff at one point too in the mid 90s with auditions. And he actually got Eric Bischoff an audition for a show in LA that ended up being Access Hollywood, if you can believe it or not. Barry Bloom actually helped Eric Bischoff get an audition with Access Hollywood. Didn't work out, obviously, and he ended up, being with WCW. But Waltman got the meeting with Barry Bloom, and Barry Bloom was talking to him about acting, but Barry Bloom also said, hey, by the way, WCW, Eric Bischoff, Ted Turner are opening up the checkbooks. They are looking for more free agent talent, and they're willing to pay for it. And Sean Waltman was like, that's really interesting. And it was not something that occurred to him at the time. He wasn't really interested in leaving the WWF necessarily for WCW, but he told Barry Bloom, he said, well, I don't know about leaving, but, Razor Ramon's contract he said Scott Hall's contract is coming up. And Barry Bloom was like, who's Scott Hall? And Sean Waltman was like, Razor Ramon. And Barry Bloom told me like he almost fell out of his chair when he realized that Razor Ramon was coming due to his contract, because that's how big Razor Ramon was, a big star. And Scott Hall at that time didn't even realize that WCW was even interested or would be interested, or that wasn't even an option for him, because these guys are just on the road 300 days a year and they're just grinding and trying to keep their bodies in shape and, putting their bodies through hell and then trying to, go to the gym to try to, rebuild and look good on TV. So he had no idea, but they called him from the office right there on speakerphone, Barry Bloom and Sean Waltman. And right away, Scott Hall was interested because WCW was going to be offering potentially more money and fewer dates. And that was very important to him. And very quickly from there, Scott Hall hired Barry Bloom as his agent and he signed with WCW. And then the rest is kind of history, right? I mean, then Kevin Nash followed. Kevin Nash, then he didn't hire Barry Bloom right away, but he did eventually hire Barry Bloom. And, those guys got paid big money. And really, like, we talk about the impact of the nWo on wrestling. They were like almost labor leaders in a sense, right? They were able to get guaranteed money from WCW, fewer dates, and that broke the mold of what was going on in wrestling at the time. Vince McMahon had to change his entire strategy when it came to salaries. He started offering guaranteed money. So like Bret Hart then got a guaranteed contract. The Undertaker got a guaranteed contract after that. Shawn Michaels. But before that, those guys, none of them had guaranteed contracts. Only Hogan was like the guy in the WWF at one point who had a guaranteed contract. So they changed the game for so many people, for the wrestlers today who, a lot of them are doing pretty well, right? Some would argue maybe not as well as they could or should be doing, but a lot of those guys and girls owe a lot of what they're making now to what Hall and Nash did by taking a chance and going over to WCW, and that completely, shattered kind of like the labor structure in the sport, in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, look at Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns, where they take less dates for more money, and like, where the hell did that come from? Well, Hall and Nash kind of started that many, many years ago, and kind of, like you said, broke that mold where you got the guaranteed contract and you got less dates.
Yeah. I mean, and then that led to, so many big contracts then in the late 90s. And again, some would argue that maybe too many big contracts for WCW because, things kind of took a turn in 99 and 2000 and beyond. But yeah, those guys are, the nWo touched so many aspects of it. Like even like, going through like the legal documents and everything. A lot of people don't know this, but part of the case against WCW was that Mark Madden on the WCW hotline was kind of disparaging the WWF and implying that Hall and Nash still worked for the WWF, right? And Mark Madden got called as a witness to a deposition, right?
Yep.
And he said, I'm a journalist. I don't need to give my sources out about who told me this information because I'm a journalist. So the WWF opened up an entirely new case. They sued Mark Madden because they argued that he was not a journalist. He was working for WCW, and he was part of like the entertainment aspect of it, right? So they opened up a whole new case that went to like an appeals court, and believe it or not, like that case set the precedent legally of what constitutes a journalist, because the judge ended up ruling that while Mark Madden might have been employed as a journalist at one point, when he was giving out that information on the WCW hotline, he was not acting as a journalist. And they determined that being a journalist was gathering information with the intent to inform and do investigations and then tell the public. And that was not necessarily what Mark Madden was doing as part of the WCW hotline. And that remains as like legal precedent for who and what a journalist is. I mean, because of the nWo. I mean, can you believe that? Isn't that insane?
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, when you really like think about it, like, oh my God, another thing that they're kind of they're setting up legal precedents now. You know what I mean? Like, geez Louise, nWo. Did WCW end up paying that, or did Madden have to pay it personally?
Well, he didn't end up like, so when I say sued, they basically filed like something that compelled him to talk. So he had to talk. He had to give up his sources. And I think by the time he actually got in front of like a deposition again to tell those sources, he said he had forgotten who told him in the first place. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what he said.
Wow, nice. I obviously was buddies with Kevin Sullivan before he passed, but we were talking about when he got called for the deposition and kind of like Jerry McDivitt, the legendary WWE attorney. Actually, surprisingly, he's been on my show. I talked to him a bunch. Great guy. just to throw that out there, not because everyone has maybe a bad connotation of him, but he brought in Sullivan for deposition. He wanted to see all of his scripts and all of his notes, and was he writing WWF on it, right? I mean, it's crazy what they had to go through.
Yeah, one of the things too so Kevin Sullivan would kind of he would write the pre-show stuff, like the formats. He would be a big part of putting that together. And then after the show was over, or I guess even during the show, there would be a log that WCW, an associate producer named Michelle Baines, would write a log of what would be on the show. And one of the things that they got them on in the case is that in those logs of those May 96, June 96 Nitros, they were being referred, Scott Hall was being referred to as Razor Ramon or RR. And that was one of the things that Jerry McDevitt really latched onto, okay, you're not saying it on TV, but internally it's pretty clear that you're referring to these people as their WWF characters. And that was a sticking point that definitely did not help WCW's case.
Crazy too. If you look at Diamond Stud, Razor Ramon is just Diamond Stud. So they could have or should have went back to that. I know they're calling him RR and stuff and internally, but they should have just went back and said, look, he had a toothpick when he was Diamond Stud. He literally did the whole thing as Diamond Stud. He was acting like almost not exactly like hey, yo, Cuban guy, but he's still doing the same mannerism, acted exactly the same, dressed almost the same as Diamond Stud, which was obviously a precursor to Razor Ramon.
And that was a big argument from the WCW side of things that, well, when Scott Hall came in as Razor Ramon in the WWF, he was just taking from the Diamond Stud character and kind of adapting it. So Razor Ramon really wasn't all that, unique or special that you needed to have your intellectual property tied to it because the guy was just playing that similar character in WCW. So when he came over, he was just playing, a version of the Diamond Stud or, Scott Hall, whatever. And one of the most fascinating parts of the trial, and I did interview Jerry McDevitt and the WCW attorney David Dunn, and one of the most fascinating things to me, John, about that trial is kind of what fascinates me about wrestling in general, because a big part of that was, where does the character end and the person begin? And Jerry McDevitt's argument was that Scott Hall, when he came to WCW, they were calling him Scott Hall eventually, right? The Scott Hall that people knew from wrestling, the Scott Hall character, was from the AWA, right? And that Scott Hall, who was much bigger, more muscular, had, a bushy mustache, different hair, wasn't as tan, right? He did not look or feel the same as the Scott Hall that came to WCW in 1996. So Jerry McDevitt's argument was that Scott Hall was the character from the AWA, Big Scott Hall. This guy that Scott Hall is now playing is just Razor Ramon, just a copy of Razor Ramon. And that was a big argument. But it speaks to, and both of them had really interesting ways of explaining it. It just speaks to the uniqueness of wrestling, that there's nothing quite like that, where, again, character and person, because can the character exist without the person putting themselves into it to a degree? And I would argue probably not. And what Jerry McDevitt said is that you can if Batman comes down, the stands, and you call him a different name, everyone's going to know it's Batman. And that's how he felt about Razor Ramon, Scott Hall. It's like, you call him Scott Hall, you don't call him anything, people think it's Razor Ramon. And David Dunn's explanation is, Scott Hall is a real human being. He was playing a character, but he's a real human being who puts in his own creative, ability into this character. That's not WWE's intellectual property. That's just Scott Hall's skill level as a creative. He's putting his own thing. So how can you say that Scott Hall playing a version of himself can be owned by anybody, regardless WCW or WWF or what have you? And just so fascinating, right? Because no other entertainment medium has these kinds of discussions, legal or otherwise, right? Because if you see Tom Cruise on the street, he's Tom Cruise. But if you see Terry Bollea on the street, he's Hulk Hogan, right? He's always going to be Hulk Hogan to you. And that's just so unique to wrestling.
It is so crazy. If you look at it, WWF, like obviously they sensed something like, oh, we're in trouble here. We got let's try to sue these guys. Like we need to do whatever we can to slow the momentum. Obviously, it didn't work, in front of the camera. They just
Mhm.
got buried even further. I mean, then NWO started kicking their ass for 83 plus weeks, really 2 years, really, 104 weeks if you really look at it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I get it, right? Because Vince McMahon was getting frustrated, and they were in a vulnerable position coming off the steroid trial, right? Where they lost a lot of money in that trial, and they took a major reputation hit, and they were trying to rebuild. And then at one of the most vulnerable points of the WWF, Ted Turner starts opening up the checkbook and takes Hulk Hogan and signs Macho Man Randy Savage, and then gets Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, and it was like Dave Meltzer told me that the story. We know when Kevin Nash tells WWF that he's leaving, Vince McMahon like calls Dave Meltzer and is like, Ted Turner's buying all my guys, and Meltzer is like, well, you just did the same. You did that in the '80s. Like that's how you built the WWF, by taking all the territories, top guys, and bringing them
100%.
national to the WWF. And Vince is like, well, that's different because that was me, and that they're using Ted Turner's money. Like. So it was like, that kind of like cognitive dissonance of what was going on,
Yes.
kind of the cycle of wrestling. But one thing that I found really interesting was that, and Jerry Briscoe told me this when I interviewed him for the book, was that when they lost Kevin Nash, Vince McMahon didn't take it well personally, because he liked Kevin Nash as a person, and he had an affection for him. But they felt that Scott Hall was the much bigger loss, because they felt like that Razor Ramon character still had a lot more to do in WWF, and because remember, he never had a run with the title. Diesel
Yep.
did have a run with the title for almost a year, and Razor Ramon never did, and they still felt like there was meat on the bone as far as pushing Razor Ramon and what he could possibly be. So they felt like Scott Hall was the much bigger loss. Not that they didn't think much of Kevin Nash, but they just felt like Scott Hall was a bigger one, and Kevin Nash was, a little older. He had a lot of injury issues, and they thought that he had the run with the title. They thought that he was kind of past it. And then when he went over and he became more Kevin Nash that we know now, with the wit and the intellect and the charisma and just being so funny, and because they kind of just let him do what he wanted to do in WCW, rather than being like that Diesel kind of like generic character. He really became a much bigger deal, because he had that creative freedom. And that's when they realized in the WWF, and Jerry Briscoe told me this, that like, oh wow, like there was more to Kevin Nash than what we were pushing him as Diesel.
100%. But I do feel like Hall was like the glue guy, whatever, if you will, for the NWO. Because without Hall, I don't know, it doesn't seem as cool. I mean, Nash is great and all, but it just seems like Hall is like the glue guy for. Because even when he's gone for a bit, when the NWO is, quote unquote, getting a little step, when he's gone for a little bit, that's when they
Mm-hmm.
kind of lose a lot of their momentums, because they lost the cool factor of the NWO, which was Hall.
Completely. Scott Hall's, yeah. I mean, he's all he to me, and wrestling has so many like what ifs, right? Like wrestling is filled with these what ifs of like,
Oh
what if
yeah.
this happened, and what if this person turned out, But Scott Hall to me is a massive what if, because people forget that it's not like less than a year into the NWO storyline, like in early '97, he went into rehab, and he missed, he missed a portion of time. And then it was hard to kind of like trust him in a sense, like from a creative standpoint, because is he going to be okay? Everyone knew that he was struggling with his substance issues, and then in '98 again he went into rehab, and it was a really tough time period for him. And he was, I mean, he was flipping rental cars over, man. Like he was like, driving drunk and flipping cars over. Somehow he never got hurt. I don't know how that even happened, but he got arrested a couple of times, and it was a tough stretch for him. Like really during the most popular time of the NWO in '97, '98, Hall was there a little bit, but he was also in rehab and struggling. And, you have to wonder like if he was able to kind of like get clean and like really put together like a run, like he could have been, and he should have been a world champion, and he should have been
Yeah.
someone that, he really checked all the boxes when it came to everything that you could possibly want in a pro wrestling star. He looked great, right? He was tall. He was in great shape. He had incredible charisma. He could cut a hell of a promo. He was a really good worker, especially for his size, right? And like that's the guy that you could build an entire promotion around. Like you build your whole thing around Scott Hall, but it was just hard for him to kind of stay on the straight and narrow. And then to me, that's a huge what if. As big as the nWo was, right, and as big as Razor Ramon, was. If Scott Hall was clean and had his and was able to kind of battle his demons more effectively, who knows what could have happened to him? We could be talking about, I think he's one of the most influential wrestlers of all time. Yep. He's not really talked about as one of the best. He's not on the Mount Rushmore, right? But if he was clean and sober, maybe that's a guy that would have been on the Mount Rushmore.
Man, just easily, like you said, one of the most influential, one of the best. Just so many things that he did just were the best. He had that cool factor to him for sure. But with nWo, if you don't get the third man, you don't get Hogan. I don't know if it works the way it does. You don't get the global impact. You don't get the people going, I can't believe Hulk Hogan turned heel. And obviously nowadays it's funny with Cena, to a certain extent, it didn't. People were hoping it would get that Hogan level. It didn't even like touch the Hogan heel level and stuff. So, but people were hoping and wanting and wishing. They had the blueprint with Hogan, but they didn't get there. But without Hogan turning heel, I don't know if you get there. I mean, obviously, Sting was a rumor, Luger's a rumor, Bret Hart's a rumor, Bulldog, Mabel is oddly a weird rumor. But if it's not Hogan, it doesn't work.
Completely agree. You needed Hogan. You needed the shock of the heel turn. You needed him to commit to being a heel. It brought a different level to the nWo. If it had been Sting, it would have been a good storyline. It would have been a good angle. It would have been fine. I'm sure it would have done good business. But we're talking about this in 2025. And if it was Sting in that position, John, I don't think we're talking about that. I'm pretty confident in saying we're not talking about it almost 30 years later. It had to be Hogan. And because he was the hero. He was the hero of the 80s, right? And now he became the anti-hero of the 90s, which is an incredible, like the two runs that he had are just unprecedented in my opinion. But you needed Hogan, and really you needed all three of those guys. People have asked me so many times, like, who would be the nWo now, or, who else would have, made it work the way they did? And the answer is no one. The answer is like that core three all brought different things to the table that made the nWo what it was. And there's no nWo without Hogan, Hall, and Nash together as a unit. That is really what made it as special as it became.
Totally agree. Just it's unbelievable the way it came together. And the fact with Hogan too, because obviously there's the stories of him cutting promos like Hulk would, and Hall and Nash were like, you need to be more like sound bites and cut it short. Like they're like kind of showing him the way a little bit of how he needs to be Hollywood instead of Hulk, right? I mean, they're helping him.
Yeah, Hogan credits Scott Hall for kind of teaching him how to be a heel. And that was something that did not come naturally to Hogan. He was a heel before, we all know that he was a heel in the AWA. And but at that level, like on national TV, cutting the promos, and after so many years with Hulkamania and doing things in a very certain particular way that, by the way, worked very well for him, right? That made him a ton of money. It made him the most recognizable wrestler ever at that point, right? To completely have to change like the game plan, change the plot, change everything, his appearance, everything that he was doing. And he credits Hall and Nash, especially Hall, for doing that. But helping him, teaching him how to get that heat and everything like that. So it's again, the triumvirate, that trio is really, a special one in wrestling history, because it just does not work without all of them. And Hogan was the final piece, the one that they needed to get to the next level, and they got it. And it's interesting because like Hogan in the beginning of his heel turn, there wasn't a lot of trust there because he just didn't know those guys, right? He didn't know Hall and Nash when they turned. He really, I don't even know I think he probably met Scott Hall in WWF, but he really didn't know Nash, and they weren't friends. And it took him a little while to kind of gain that trust. They had to build that trust with Hogan because, Hogan didn't have a lot of trust in wrestling. He really didn't. He had his inner circle, right? But as far as like trust, even Vince McMahon, who he trusted at one point, tried to move on from him by putting the title on the Ultimate Warrior in 1990, right? And I think Hogan always felt some resentment about that Vince McMahon was betting on the Ultimate Warrior as like the next horse in the race, and Hogan felt like that was a terrible decision and it should have still been him at the top of the company. And of course, he ended up being right at that point, right? Because Ultimate Warrior did not work out as the face of the WWF, and they had to put the title back on Hogan and give him kind of the keys to the kingdom again. So he was right in that regard. But that moment in time in 1990 is really what formed and shaped like the political Hulk Hogan of the mid 90s that people always talk about, because he was still insecure about and almost paranoid about that same thing happening again, where he should be the top guy in the industry. He was the one making the money, and they tried to move on from him. And he really did not want to let that happen again. He was like, I was right that time. Vince was wrong. And I'm going to continue to being the face of this industry for as long as I possibly can, because that's what's best for business. And he really, really believed that. People say that, Hulk Hogan was all about him. He was selfish, and maybe that's an element of truth, but he felt he didn't think that he was selfish. He just felt like, I'm Hulk Hogan. I'm the guy that has drawn more than anyone else in the history of the business. You got to give me the ball and let me keep it, because that's going to be what is best for WCW's business at the time.
Yep. And it's funny, like so many of the wrestlers you talk to about it, they agree Hogan should have the ball because they were making more money when he had the ball. So like the smarter guys are like, yes, he's the right guy for it because I'm going to make more money. So everybody, if you're business wise, if you're business smart, has that sense to them, like he should be champ.
Yeah, and especially when the salaries were not guaranteed, right? Because in the WWF, when Hogan was there, it's like, hell yeah, because we're drawing a big house because of Hulk, and I'm making more money because of him, because he's putting the butts in the seats. It changed a little bit, though, when you have the guaranteed money. It changed because then, you saw in a little bit in 97 and then 98 where things really kind of got heated between, Hall, Nash, and Hogan, that there was that kind of like power struggle for the soul of the NWO. Like, who is the real NWO? Is it Hulk Hogan or is it Hall and Nash? And they both felt like they were the ones that brought more to the table, that made the group what it was. Of course, as we all know, as I said before, it took all three. You needed all three. You can't have one without the other. But in 98, once kind of like the honeymoon period was over, there was that struggle, that battle for like who was really the NWO, and that necessitated the split from the Wolfpack, to and the NWO Black and White. That was kind of like, it was almost like art imitating life, because back behind the scenes, they were not happy, right? Sean Waltman gets fired in 98. Yep. Hall and Nash are pissed off at Bischoff because that was a signal to them and to everyone else in the locker room, all the boys, that Bischoff was kind of throwing in with Hulk Hogan politically, because they just, fired the best friend of Hall and Nash. So it kind of like, from a clout and like, stroke standpoint, he was kind of making it known that Hall and Nash are not the guys, that it's actually Hogan. And that's how they felt about it. So a lot of that stuff was going on in 98. And, these things happen, right? We're all human beings. Egos are involved. These guys are, also exhausted from being on the road 300 days a year almost, and, doing a lot of extracurricular activities with, some drugs and alcohol. And, things blew over in 98 and they got heated. And, they were never really able to kind of pull it back together. They did try, and they did, they truced. But, the fact there was no Hogan versus Nash match at the height of the popularity of the Wolfpack in 98 at some point, to me, that should have been the Starrcade main event. And then, of course, Hogan stepped away for a little bit. He ran for president and whatnot. But that was a really, when I'm watching that back, man, and I love 97 WCW. It was really enjoyable to go back and watch it. It was really great. The storylines were coherent. The matches were good. 98, things kind of started to go off the rails a little bit. It was still entertaining at times. But the fact that, like, as I'm watching this, knowing what I know now about wrestling rather than, when I was a kid watching it, is you split the Wolfpack off. Like, how do you not do a Hogan versus Nash, like, big blow-off match? Because that's the story. That's the story. It's Hogan versus Nash. They're making these like shoot comments against each other in promos. It's like the heat there was Hogan versus Nash, and it just never happened until the finger poke of doom, and that we all know how, anticlimactic that was.
Yes, terrible. I love those like little shots where Nash would be like, "Oh, you're wearing your wife's sunglasses," and like Hogan would be like, "What? And they would just go back and forth. I just thought that was so funny. I was like, "Wow, little bit of realism going on here with these two. There's a power struggle."
It was a lot of it was real. A lot of the comments they were making about each other were legitimate. It was part of the storyline, but it was also real. It was real. And then Sean Waltman goes on Raw, right, and he cuts that promo with DX about Hulk Hogan. Eric Bischoff.
Yes.
Hulk Hogan, you better not stop short, otherwise Eric Bischoff's going to go, all the way up. Your what?
Yes.
Like that's a shoot comment, but also kind of works in the storyline too with the Wolfpack against I guess the NWO Black and White. Like such a unique time, and I feel like that's hard to duplicate today. Like all that chaos that was just like, it was just so great for fans, right? We were just eating that stuff up, like, oh my god, I can't believe he said that on Raw. Holy crap, just awesome, just so fun, chaotic, but in a fun way.
And remember what Hogan said about Waltman, why he was gone. He couldn't cut the mustard, brother, and he said it right to Nash. Yeah,
your little buddy can't cut the mustard. Yeah, I mean, again, reality. There was a lot of reality to what he was saying, because if you ask folks like Hall and Nash and others in the locker room, they felt like Waltman getting fired was a complete political play by Bischoff and by Hogan.
Think about it too. Waltman going over there, that was a huge misstep. That helped WWF so much. That helped Triple H get over. That helped DX get over. DX was, kind of lame at that point. I mean, you're about to get Road Dogg and Billy in there, who are super over at that point. So you're about to get them, but Triple H was kind of floundering. He wasn't really that over at that point. But you throw an NWO guy in, forget about it. I mean, geez, you throw an NWO guy, especially Waltman 6, who was maybe the third most over guy, fourth most over guy, if you will, in the group. Just huge misstep by WCW at that point.
Completely. It really was. And I think that Sean Waltman is a guy that does not get the credit that he deserves for his contributions during that time period, because he was in the NWO. First of all, he was the 1-2-3 kid, and the upset of Razor Ramon was one of the coolest things that happened in like wrestling in the early 90s, right? That was so memorable.
Yes. Yep.
So he had that moment. Then he became a member of the NWO, really important member of the NWO in 96, 97, and 98. And then he became part of DX, and he got over huge as part of DX, and that group became massive as well. So it's like, and also, of course, how could I forget? He gave the world the crotch chop pause. Like, I mean, come on.
Yes.
Like people are still doing that. Joel Embiid on the Philadelphia 76ers is getting fined for doing this like every year in the NBA in 2025. And he was doing, and Waltman was doing this in 96 with the NWO. I mean, just an underrated member of like the, talk about the night, how big 90s wrestling was, but Sean Waltman was in the thick of so many of these big things.
Yeah. Big time. Crazy thing too is obviously it seems like a punishment to Hall and Nash, and like you said with Bischoff making a political statement there that's aligning with Hogan. Not only are you going to fire their best friend and then obviously not give him the money he wanted, so then fire him. Then you have Hall, when he does come back, he doesn't even get to be with Nash and be the real Wolfpack, because the real Wolfpack is Hall, Nash, and 6. They're the Wolfpack. That's who really is, and they don't even get to be the Wolfpack. You have to team up with Hogan, so there's another punishment added on politically wise.
Exactly, and like no one wanted that. The fans didn't want that, and like that. The Hall versus Nash program, that feud was awful, and you could tell neither one of them were into it, and the fans weren't into it. It didn't make sense. There was no explanation as to no good explanation as to why Hall would even turn on Nash. It was, and then to your point about like that, like the kind of political message of firing Waltman. Right after that, the Disciple joins the NWO, right? Brutus Beefcake, Ed Leslie, Hogan's best friend, joins the NWO. So it was very symbolic, where Hall and Nash had their best friend fired, and Hogan gets his best friend part of the NWO really in the span of a few weeks.
Which is crazy, because you think about the original, when the NWO starts at Hogwild 96, well, not starts, when Hogan gets a title, Beefcake tries to give him the birthday, because it's Hogan's birthday in August, and he's trying to give him the birthday, and they beat the crap out of him, signaling that Hogan isn't going to be like that. You know what I mean? He's kind of showing them for the NWO, and even politically, I'm with Hall and Nash, and like kind of like, I'm not going to have my friends. Remember, they beat up the Nasty Boys at the hotel, and that thing. So that like all of his friends are getting beat up, and they're not a part of the NWO. So that was like a huge shift too. You're like, oh, now we're completely changing what the NWO is about.
100%. And there was so much like the political posturing was interesting because the Nasty Boys were very good friends with Hogan, and
Yep.
in late '96 and early '97 they got into like a legitimate fight with Hall and Nash that a lot of people forget about. That Jerry Saggs gets hit with either a chair or a title during a tag team match, and he felt like Hall or Nash was kind of taking liberties with him, and they got into a big thing backstage. And I think the Nasty Boys probably figured that Hogan might come to their aid politically. No one got fired, but Jerry Saggs never wrestled for WCW again after that incident with Hall and Nash. So it was just interesting how, there was kind of that posturing, even while there was a good relationship still between Hall and Nash and Hogan, there was that political posturing there where, they're making sure that one of them is going to come out, ahead, right, in the end. And it's just, it's fascinating. The culture was very different. It was very cutthroat. It was very ruthless. Like, fans in wrestling today, like, the culture is so different. Everyone is, they're more team players in a sense today, whereas back then it was every man for himself. It was a big Royal Rumble backstage in the locker room, and it had to be, because again, it's like, that's the culture. So if you're not going to be like that, if you're not going to be a little selfish, if you're not going to be a little ruthless backstage, you're going to get left behind, and you're not going to make the money that you need for your family, and you're not going to get all the things that you wanted. You're not going to achieve your dreams. And that was the reality back then. It was tough. That was a tough locker room.
It's amazing when you look at, obviously, all those egos and the NWO and how they basically kind of saved wrestling, because wrestling was kind of going into the doldrums there. WWF stunk, and they were kind of headed down in a down period. Then NWO comes back, Hogan turning heel. I mean, all that saves wrestling and gives you not only the Attitude Era, it gives you the whole Monday Night Wars. I mean, they changed not only the game there, but they completely changed the business. The Babe Ruth of wrestling, if you will. Hogan, and the NWO, they completely turned around the business.
Yeah, people don't realize, especially like younger fans, because wrestling as an industry was at an all-time low in the early 90s. WWF was coming off the steroid trial. Like I mentioned before, their finances were not great. Their reputation was in the hole, right? That was in the tank because of the steroids, and they were struggling. And WCW was also not doing great. They were not profitable. They didn't have high attendances. Their cable numbers were okay, like in syndication, WCW Saturday Night, but they were not really relevant on a national level so much. And it took the NWO to kind of like resuscitate things, because 90, 94, 95 were not great years as an industry, WWF or WCW, in terms of finances. And the NWO kind of like breathed new life into the wrestling business again.
Big time. I mean, they basically kind of created. Without that, where's Stone Cold Steve Austin? Where's the Attitude Era? Where's Mr. McMahon? Doesn't happen.
Exactly. Yeah, who knows what becomes of wrestling if there's no NWO? If the NWO doesn't get created and then leads to WCW winning 83 weeks in a row, does Vince McMahon change his strategy? Does he change his philosophy about wrestling and go, edgier, grittier? Does the Attitude Era happen? Does Stone Cold Steve Austin get big? Does The Rock get big? Does The Rock become one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, right? I don't know. And that's why this book is to me an important one for wrestling history and pop culture history, because the NWO was the catalyst. That they were the first domino to fall, and then everything changed after that.
Man, when you look at it, right, with WWF doing that and Mr. McMahon character, I know he kind of did it in Memphis a little bit and kind of played around with like that character, but it's really, and people don't give him enough credit, it's Eric Bischoff's character from WCW that he's just using in WWF. I mean, like Austin versus McMahon is almost NWO versus WCW, where it's like counterculture, the heels getting over on almost like on the big corporate entity, and but he's really kind of getting cheered. So I mean, there's so many similarities. Obviously, DX is the biggest ripoff of the NWO ever. Even down here, remember Hall, like you said with Ashbrook, kind of turned it this way, but Hall used to always go like this, down here, whatever. They even took that. I mean, they took everything. I know they're friends with them, so it's fine. But it's like, man, there's so much stolen from WCW and the NWO that WWF kind of takes and kind of brings it to the next level. But even Mr. McMahon, that's Eric Bischoff's character.
Yeah, people forget that Eric Bischoff was playing that evil authority figure quite well, by the way, quite well.
The best, yeah.
Like him firing Randy Anderson in front of his entire family, like on Nitro, was like one of like my I hesitate to say favorite because it was so like ruthless, right?
Yeah.
But it was compelling television,
Tell
And Randy
daddy
Anderson
he's
comes back from
fired.
cancer, and they fire him in front of his whole family. I actually
Yeah.
interviewed Randy Anderson, the late Randy Anderson's wife, and his son about that segment for the book. And one of my favorite parts of the book, really, because they were so good, and people in their community in Rome, Georgia, thought that it was real, man. They thought that it was legit. Like they got so many calls. My condolences. I'm so sorry that happened. And like Randy Anderson's wife had to be like, this is not true. But they still didn't believe her. They still didn't believe her. They really thought it was legit. They were blowing up the phones at Turner. Like Eric Bischoff got called to Harvey Schiller's office, his boss, because HR got calls that he fired someone on national television the night before.
So good. Tell daddy he's still fired. That's great.
That's
The
right.
Steiners had to give back the belts, which I guess when they ruined one of the title belts, they never fixed it for a while. Remember, they threw down the belt and they broke it. They never fixed it for a while. Yeah,
That's true. That's true.
What a time. That was so just. There's so many different little things that I feel like maybe people have forgotten over time because WWF changed the narrative and everything else. But Bischoff is kind of creating that character, even with Piper, when Piper sets it off, you're a liar, and then he kind of sets off the Bischoff character where finally gets revealed that he's like the the future Mr. McMahon, but revealed as that evil, sinister boss that's been lying to everybody and manipulating people behind the scenes.
Yeah. And when Bischoff challenges Vince McMahon for Slamboree in '98, I know people kind of remember that as like, maybe past the 83-week streak, but just a fun moment where it's like, wow, I can't believe he's really doing this. He's addressing Vince McMahon live on Nitro, cutting a promo, challenging him to a match. Bischoff told me that Hogan and Savage told him that Vince is going to show up, that Vince is going to fight you. Like Hogan and Savage really believed that Vince was going to answer that challenge and actually fight Bischoff for real. Of course, that didn't actually happen. But in the back of his head, Eric told me that he was actually like half preparing for a match. Like he had a strategy of what he was going to do if they had a real fight. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's great.
And one thing too that I'll add, at the time, Bischoff, he was younger than Vince and he had that karate background. He was very confident that if that fight did happen, that he would win it, right? But now, fast forward many years later, now he said he's not as sure. He's now worked with Vince, he knows kind of who he is as a person, and he said that he's a very tenacious human being, and it might have been a harder fight than he realized.
Right, yeah, changing his tune a little bit there. Maybe the karate wouldn't have worked out against the big muscle-bound Vince. Although Vince would have been slower though, so
that was part of the strategy. Tire him out, kick the legs. Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating too. Like the two bosses of the company might have a legit shoot fight just because one guy called out the other on television. That's awesome.
I missed that part, the craziness of wrestling.
And I think that was, if I remember correctly, Stephanie was graduating from college, so he couldn't miss her graduation, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't going to actually show up at Slamboree. It was in Worcester, Mass. It was in the neighborhood, but that wasn't going to happen.
Shivani even has a great line. He goes, "Oh, if just by chance, if we see, Jim Ross show up to the building holding somebody's bags, Vince is behind him." I was like, "Holy crap!" Like, oh, we're even shooting on the announcers. Oh, geez. What a war. Crazy. What crazy time.
Great. It was so great for fans, though, because it was so, when you have that competition, it changes things. Like WWE without competition, just, for many years, it just didn't have that, like, that je ne sais quoi like that, but now it's like, now they're fighting, WWE and AEW, like it's back to an extent, not like it was, but that competition really, really is great for fans.
Yeah, think about it. Without WCW, WWF, like kind of was indulgent, maybe stale for like 20 years. AEW comes around. Then we get the bloodline. We get this great kind of surge from Roman Reigns, the first $1 billion champion, but all his acting, his storyline, him with Heyman, him with the Usos, solos, that bringing him in, and just so great. Without AEW, I don't even know if they probably let's not put the gas on. Let's just hit the brakes. Kind of what you do for 20 years. It's like we'll pop a rating here or there or whatever. But you have to put the pedal to the metal. You want AEW catching up.
Competition, breeds success in many cases, and it's just better for the fans. And if it's better for the fans and fans are enjoying it more, they're going to act with their wallets, with their pocketbooks, right? They're going to spend more money. They're going to go to shows. And look where we are now. I mean, WWE is thriving. They're red hot. The buildings are all sold out. PLEs are big time. They're on Netflix. And AEW, more modestly, is doing well too. I mean, what they've been able to do is so impressive in a very short period of time. And they're the number two. There's no doubt about it. But they have a great product too, and they do decent ratings and they do decent crowds. Their pay-per-views are excellent. Those numbers are good, and it feels like we're kind of in another golden age right now.
No doubt about it. I agree, especially financially. If you got $1 billion champion, obviously you're doing pretty damn well for sure. So as we hit the wind down here and head towards the finish, give us one last big push for the book. Say hello to the bad guys.
Yes, sir. So it's available today, June 24th. It's out. I'm super excited for it because I was working on it for 4 years. And I think it's a great book for the hardcore fans because I'm a hardcore fan, right? So I intended to try to find things that people did not know to add to the narratives that exist that have been out there for a long time. I know there's been a lot of coverage of this period of wrestling, of course. And for the lapsed fans, I think this book is going to really, really hit because there were so many folks who were watching back then in the 90s that are no longer watching. That's just the facts, right? 10 million plus people watching on Monday nights. A lot of them went away. And I think that this is going to hit the nostalgia factor a lot for those folks who are, who maybe haven't watched wrestling in 20 years, but they were nWo fans or Austin 316 fans, whatever, Austin, Rock. This is going to really hit for them right in the feels, I would say, because of the nostalgia. And then for non-fans, man, they're an important audience too, because one of the goals of this book is just to share wrestling with people and help people understand why it's been so influential and how that happened, why that happened, and so on and so forth. And I think that for non-fans who are curious about how WWE is $1 billion company and how Dwayne Johnson became the biggest star in Hollywood and, why Bad Bunny, is wrestling and why all these folks are, big wrestling fans, I think this is a good book to kind of understand that, kind of put it in perspective in the context of just how influential the nWo and then wrestling as a whole, more generally, had that impact on American culture.
Say hello to the bad guys, how professional wrestling's New World Order legitimately, this is true, changed America. Where could everybody get this great book? Anywhere
you get your books, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, anywhere you get your books. Hopefully your local independent bookstore, you can ask them if they have it. But it's out wide. It's out there now in the wild.
Marc, this is awesome. It feels like once a year we're talking either UFC or WWE or nWo. So I love it. We got to have you back on.
Anytime, man. You know that. Anytime you need me, I got you.
Awesome. Marc, thank you so much. Appreciate it.